Okay, welcome to this deep dive. Today we are um, really getting into a challenging perspective on a pretty heavy topic,
Mm.
the psychology behind war and political power.
Yeah, it's definitely heavy stuff.
Our source material for this dive is an analysis of an article by Larken Rose, and it's provocatively titled The Psychology of War and Power, Why Leaders Want Violence.
And look, this isn't exactly a comfortable read. The analysis really lays out Rose's stance, and it's one that fundamentally questions, the common assumptions about why conflicts happen, and maybe more importantly, the core motivations of people in charge.
Absolutely. So what we're aiming to do today is navigate this specific analysis, pull out the most important ideas it's presenting, and help you understand its central arguments.
And it's really vital we stress this here. We're exploring the framework and the claims made in this source material.
Exactly. We aren't endorsing any specific political viewpoints or the claims within it. We're simply trying to convey the ideas presented for you to consider.
It's definitely a look at war and politics you might not have encountered before.
For sure. Okay, let's unpack this.
Right.
So the core idea presented in the source material, like right at the start, is pretty stark. According to Larken Rose's perspective, as presented here, war isn't something leaders reluctantly kind of scumble into.
No, it's framed completely differently. It's presented as a tool they actively seek out and even design.
That's the controversial starting point, isn't it?
Hmm.
The analysis highlights Rose's assertion that leaders, and he specifically mentions those in power in places like the U.S. and Israel in his article,
Yeah, he names names.
they don't just tolerate conflict. He argues they desire it and actively manufacture it.
And the why behind this.
Well, the source suggests it's because war directly serves their personal and political agendas. It allegedly leads to, more power for them, increased control over populations, greater public obedience.
And critically, widespread fear.
Yeah,
Fear that can be manipulated.
right. It's a perspective that completely flips the conventional wisdom on its head.
Mm.
The idea that leaders pursue peace and only go to war as a last desperate resort.
Yeah, this analysis presents war as a deliberate strategy, essentially for consolidating state power.
Okay, now diving into some of the specific claims and insights drawn out by this analysis. The first one tackles what Rose apparently sees as a fundamental misunderstanding about the psychology of people in charge.
Yes, the source suggests Rose argues that a lot of people make this crucial error. They project their own sense of morality onto political leaders.
Meaning they assume these leaders deep down basically mean well. Maybe they make mistakes or they're just reacting to tough situations.
Exactly. But this analysis asserts, based on Rose's article, that leaders like Trump and Netanyahu, in his view, remember, are not driven by a desire for justice or genuinely protecting their citizens.
So what are they driven by, according to this source?
Instead, the claim in the source is that they actively seek out chaos, destruction, and death. And not as tragic side effects, but as alleged means to consolidate their power.
Wow.
The analysis uses a really pointed analogy here. It's like imagining a wolf is protecting sheep, when in reality, it's solely focused on feeding itself. It's suggesting that the fundamental motives of leaders might be drastically different and maybe far more self-serving than the public generally assumes.
That wolf analogy really does force you to think about, well, alleged underlying motives, doesn't it?
Mhm.
And this perspective, it doesn't shy away from deeply controversial claims. The analysis highlights one particularly difficult point regarding casualties.
It does. It's probably one of the most challenging parts. The source notes Rose's assertion that, according to his view, someone like Netanyahu welcomes civilian casualties, particularly among Israelis.
Okay, wait. That sounds incredibly shocking. How does the analysis even explain the alleged logic behind a claim like that?
Well, the stated reasoning presented in the article, according to the analysis, is that these casualties fuel intense national outrage.
Right, you can see how that would happen.
And that outrage, in turn, is framed as a tool
Mhm.
that allegedly justifies further war and galvanizes fervent public support for the leadership.
Ah, I see the connection being made.
The source emphasizes that Rose puts this claim forward very deliberately almost to force the reader to confront this alleged psychological strategy used by those who, in his view, profit from conflict.
So one of the kind of teaching points drawn from the source is that this emotional manipulation, using what the article calls righteous outrage, is presented as a core element of war propaganda.
Exactly. It's about weaponizing intense public emotion, allegedly, to drive support for military action. It raises really difficult questions about how public sentiment is, well, potentially engineered during conflict.
Yeah, definitely. The analysis also looks at symbols of authoritarianism, like it mentions Trump's military parade.
Right. And the source interprets this and similar displays of state power as spectacles. Spectacles allegedly designed to manufacture a public need for strong leadership.
Manufacture a need. How so?
It connects back to historical observations, like it references Plato's idea that tyrants often invent or emphasize external threats. Why?
Yeah.
To make people crave the government's protection, to make them feel dependent on it.
Ah, okay. So the key takeaway here, according to this perspective, is that fear creates dependency.
Pretty much. Without perceived threats or chaos, there's less perceived need for government saviors or for expanding state power.
So these displays aren't just about showing military strength.
According to this view, no. They're framed as psychological operations, really, aimed at fostering public reliance and justifying more state control down the line.
And speaking of alleged strategic operations and, generating perceived threats, the analysis brings up a pretty significant historical example. False flags. Specifically, it mentions Operation Northwoods.
Yeah, and this is cited in the source not as some theory, but as a real declassified U.S. military document.
Declassified, wow. And according to the analysis of this document, what did it propose?
It allegedly proposed staging false flag attacks on American citizens themselves.
On Americans. Why?
To create public justification for a war with Cuba back in the 1960s.
Good grief. What kind of attacks?
The source mentions specific, really chilling proposals detailed within Operation Northwoods, things like fake airplane crashes, violent attacks on U.S. soil designed to look like Cuban acts of terror.
That's disturbing.
It is. And the educational insight drawn from this in the analysis is key. Examples like this are used to demonstrate that false flags and the idea of governments potentially sacrificing their own citizens are presented not as just wild conspiracy theories,
Right.
but as documented strategic proposals within recent U.S. history. It's meant to show this kind of thinking has existed at high levels.
That's a really anchoring detail, isn't it? Albeit a deeply disturbing one. It definitely gives a different weight to some of these arguments presented in the source material.
It does.
Now, the analysis doesn't just limit these alleged strategies to external conflict, right? It also claims internal division is actively orchestrated.
Yes, Rose asserts, according to the source, that both major U.S. parties, Democrats and Republicans, are allegedly complicit in manufacturing societal division.
Both parties. Complicit how?
The analysis claims he argues that they actually cooperate behind the scenes to generate civil unrest. It mentions using past events in places like Los Angeles as examples to push specific agendas. Could be gun control, could be nationalism, could be demanding more authoritarian responses from the state. Whatever serves the larger agenda, allegedly.
And he criticizes both sides in this analysis for being sort of willingly blind to their own party's role in this perceived orchestration.
Exactly. While being very quick to blame the opposition, of course.
Of course.
The source uses a powerful metaphor here. It's like cheering passionately for one side in a professional wrestling match. Completely unaware that the entire event is scripted and controlled by the same overarching organization. It suggests the perceived political battles are, in this view, largely a manufactured performance.
A performance serving a hidden, shared agenda of control. That's quite the image.
It is, and it leads directly into another core idea from the analysis. Government feeds on division.
Okay, explain that.
This perspective argues that genuine peace, cooperation, unity among citizens, that's actually bad for the state, in a way.
Bad how?
Because it leaves governments with no clear justification for expanding their power and control. If everyone gets along, why do you need more laws, more surveillance, bigger budgets?
Right, I see the logic presented there. So from this viewpoint, things like strife, war, civil unrest, riots, these aren't just unfortunate side effects or accidents of history.
No. They are presented as intentional strategies, things deliberately provoked or, at the very least, exacerbated to justify expanding state control, surveillance powers, military budgets, you name it.
And the source brings in historical context here, too.
It does. It references James Madison's warning. If tyranny ever comes, it will be under the guise of fighting a foreign enemy.
A classic warning.
And it's used here to support the idea that creating or emphasizing external threats, real or perceived, is a time-tested, effective tool for centralizing power domestically and suppressing dissent.
Makes sense in that framework. The analysis also delves into some speculation on the long-standing U.S.-Israel alliance, doesn't it?
It does. Rose speculates, according to the source, on the underlying reasons for what many see as unwavering U.S. political support for Israel, even when it faces significant international criticism, say, regarding human rights.
And what kind of reasons does he speculate about? It's usually framed as strategic interest or shared values.
Well, the analysis mentions that he implies things beyond that, things like potential blackmail, influence operations. It even references figures like Jeffrey Epstein, suggesting those kinds of dynamics might play a role in explaining this consistent support.
Wow, okay, so that's moving into some pretty speculative territory there, connecting it to potential hidden leverage.
It is speculative, and the source presents it as such, but the argument being interpreted is that U.S. support for Israeli military actions might not just be political or strategic in the conventional sense.
But potentially rooted in something more personal, systemic, maybe deeply entrenched and hidden.
That's the provocative claim made in the analysis, yeah, suggesting a more complex, potentially compromising reason behind the consistent alliance than is typically acknowledged publicly.
Right, okay. Finally, the analysis seems to reach a pretty stark and, frankly, somewhat bleak conclusion about the nature of the system itself.
It does. According to Rose's analysis, as presented, every U.S. president mentioned in the article it names Bush, Trump, Biden allegedly fits a similar pattern or mold
A similar mold in what way?
when it comes to their fundamental approach to power and conflict. The claim is made that they allegedly desire dead citizens, whether American or foreign, if those casualties can be leveraged
Leverage to justify what?
to justify military expansion or increase authoritarian control at home. That's the core assertion.
That's a heavy accusation across the board.
Extremely. And the message directed at voters, according to this analysis, is equally direct and challenging. Stop participating in what it calls the lesser evil game, meaning voting for the major parties is framed as actively enabling and perpetuating a system that, in this specific viewpoint presented by Rose, is fundamentally built on seeking death, generating fear, and consolidating domination.
So essentially, a critique of the entire mainstream political process as fundamentally flawed and dangerous.
That's the difficult and far-reaching summation, yeah. It argues the fundamental nature of the political system, as interpreted by Rose in this analysis, is inherently geared towards conflict and control, regardless of who is nominally in charge.
Okay. So based on this deep dive into the source material, digging into this analysis of Rose's work, there's some key potential takeaways or maybe lessons that the analysis encourages you, the listener, to consider.
Yeah, absolutely. The analysis really suggests cultivating a default skepticism, maybe? Like, never just assume good intent in geopolitics without clear, verifiable evidence. It pushes you to question stated motives.
And it emphasizes understanding historical precedent. Right. Using examples like Operation Northwoods, which we discussed, before forming opinions on current political actions. Context is presented as absolutely key.
Definitely. It also tries to highlight the alleged mechanisms of manipulation, learning how fear, nationalism, war rhetoric are potentially used as psychological tools to influence and control populations. Being aware of those techniques.
And critically evaluating information from all sides of the political spectrum is also presented as crucial. Not just accepting one party's narrative or the mainstream account without question.
Right. And finally, the analysis implies the importance of studying events presented as historical false flags and understanding psychological operations not as just theories, but as documented real-world phenomena that have apparently been considered or used.
So, not dismissing these ideas outright, but engaging with the historical record presented.
Exactly.
This deep dive has certainly presented a very, very challenging framework for thinking about conflict and political power. No easy answers here.
Not at all. It really pushes you to look beyond the surface narratives, the ones often presented by those in power, and question the potential underlying motivations driving their actions, what's really going on.
And the specific examples cited from the source analysis, like Operation Northwoods, they do provide concrete details, disturbing details, but details that help anchor these complex and often abstract ideas.
And understanding these perspectives, even if you ultimately disagree with them or find them difficult to hear or even offensive,
Yeah.
it can still be incredibly valuable. Valuable in helping you navigate the constant stream of information, the conflicting reports, all the different viewpoints you encounter every day. It encourages a deeper, more critical level of analysis, perhaps.
Yeah, I think that's fair to say. So we've taken a deep dive today into a provocative analysis, one suggesting that some leaders, according to the source, actively seek out war and division for their own gain.
Using fear, outrage, and manipulation as deliberate tools of statecraft.
The source material highlighted some very specific and, let's be honest, highly controversial claims regarding U.S. and Israeli politics.
It referenced disturbing historical examples like Operation Northwoods, claiming documented precedent for these kinds of strategies.
And it presented a really stark conclusion about the alleged inherent nature of political power itself, at least as viewed through this particular lens.
It's definitely a perspective that forces you, or invites you maybe, to question stated motivations and look for potential underlying strategies that aren't immediately obvious on the surface.
Right, so here's a thought to leave you with, based on the framework presented in this deep dive today.
Hmm.
If political power is, as this source suggests, intentionally fueled by division and fear,
If that premise is accepted for the sake of argument.
what does that perspective imply about the power of a unity, independent thought, and critical thinking?
Yeah.
Could those be forces that potentially counteract that dynamic and help shape the world differently? Something to think about.